And thank you very much for the opportunity to present this research. This research is really motivated by the question of whether or not, as citizens of developed democracies, we are providing enough support to those who have too little, right? So are we providing enough income support to make a meaningful difference in the lives of those who are poor and very poor? And in particular, we're going to pay attention to, in addition to overall levels of support, in this report, we also pay attention to what we refer to as baseline relief. So this is the amount of transfers provided to those households with no market income. And then a second dimension of safety net policy that we might care about is the extent to which households are entrapped in poverty by costs that are imposed with increases in small changes in market income. So how quickly do benefit amounts decline with small increases in earnings? So this we refer to as relief fall off here. And of course, the big question for today is how does American safety net policy compare to the policies in other post-industrial economies? How am I going to answer these questions? Well, I'm going to use the terrific resources provided in the LIST data set. But even with these state-of-the-art labor and income surveys that provide really great standardized measures of the amount of social transfers provided through different programs, there are real challenges involved in evaluating the quality of the safety net and how that varies cross-nationally. In particular, low-income households draw on varying portfolios of support. That is, they draw on different types of programs to varying amounts in different countries and as their income rises. So just focusing first on all low-income families, this is all households that with market earnings that are less than 150% of the official US poverty line. These data, of course, come from the 2010 set of surveys. Everything's reported in 2010 dollars. If we look at what we might think of as the traditional safety net programs, that is the social assistance programs, we find that in fact they provide, the amount of support that they provide to low-income households varies dramatically across countries. And if we were to only pay attention to social assistance programs, usually these are means-tested programs like TANF or EITC in the American case. If we were to only pay attention to the amount of support provided through these social assistance programs, we would have a very misleading impression of where the US stands in terms of overall levels of support provided to low-income households. In all countries, most of the support is actually provided through social insurance programs. These programs, of course, are compulsory. They usually rely on a history of contributions and are tied to past earnings. But in some countries, other programs, in particular children's benefits, provide an important source of support as well for low-income families. And so the first challenge then in assessing the quality of the safety net and how it varies across countries is in this variation across countries and how countries put together various types of programs in providing support, safety net support. And as I mentioned, not only does the total composition, the total portfolio of support vary across countries, in fact, it varies across households with their levels of earnings. So we see here in Norway, for example, almost no support is provided to any household beyond the very poor, beyond those with no market income, through what we might think of as social assistance programs. But in the UK and in the US, this provides a larger proportion of support for low-income households as well. So thinking then about this relationship between social transfers and market income, we see that in fact there are important differences in the overall relationship between social transfers reported here on the vertical axis and market income reported on the horizontal axis. In particular, we see that the total amount of support, particularly provided to those with no market earnings, that is right at the vertical axis, varies across these countries. Somewhat, on average, somewhat more is provided to low-income British households. It's slightly less to low-income households in Norway, and then the U.S. It provides just less than $20,000 to those households with no market earnings. So that's the first difference, right? Total levels of support vary across the very poor among these countries, and that's true. You'll see in the report I provided the complete set of country charts for your reference. These countries also vary in the amount of support, the amount of benefits that are provided to households that are actually quite wealthy. So if we look at the other end of the horizontal axis, those households that are earning the equivalent of $50,000 US dollars, we see that in fact what we might think of as universal transfers, right? So these are usually things like children's benefits or insurance payments. Those vary across countries too. And then the third dimension, which of course corresponds to that the third characteristic of safety net programs we might care about, the rate at which benefits decline with small changes in market income, also vary across countries as well. And so if we think about these challenges, right, the composition of programs that low-income households draw on, the amount of support provided, and the way in which that support changes with earnings, these three features make it actually quite difficult to evaluate the social net policy, to evaluate the quality of safety net policies across countries. And so what I do in the report is I use this general nonlinear relationship and the parameters that describe it to come up with what I refer to as a poverty relief ratio, right? So that is an estimate of the total amount of support that's provided to all low-income households, so all low-income households below the 150% of the US poverty line, relative to the amount of support that would be needed to bring all households up to a poverty threshold. Again, that's 150% of the poverty line. And so the total amount of support that's necessary is reported here in the dashed line, and the estimated relationship between social transfers and market income is reported here in the red line. So we can think of this in a way that's similar to a Gini coefficient, although of course that reports the cumulative income relative to population rate. This is kind of like a backwards Gini coefficient, right? So I'm estimating the area under the red line relative to the area defined by the triangle, okay? So that's what I do. What's nice about this relationship is it does a very good job of describing the relationship in a wide variety of settings. And as I said, the parameters can be used to describe key attributes of the safety net programs we might care about. In particular, if we look on the vertical axis here, we can use this relationship to estimate the overall level of baseline support, that is the amount of income that's provided to those with no market income. And then the vertical axis here reports the amount of earnings, or the amount of transfers, the change in the level of transfers relative to, as households move from zero market earnings to 1,000, right? So a very small increase in overall earnings. How much do levels of transfers, how much do benefits provided through the safety net change with this very small change in market earnings? The vertical and horizontal lines in the middle of the figures, those report kind of the median values for the set of countries included in this analysis. All right, so we might think of countries that apply in this top left quadrant then as countries that might be especially effective at providing support to low-income households. These are households that provide relatively high levels of baseline relief, that is, relatively generous levels of transfers to those households with no market earnings. And there are also countries, and here in this case just one country, although in earlier iterations some of the usual suspects, some of the Nordic countries also appear in that upper left quadrant. These are also countries where the rate of benefit decline with small increases in market income, those changes are very small, right? So these are countries that provide a lot of support to people who need a lot of support, but also ease their transition back into the labor market as well. The countries in the bottom left quadrant are those countries that similarly ease transition back into the labor market, but provide levels of support to those countries with only limited resources, just provide slightly smaller levels of support. The countries in the top right quadrant are those countries that provide relatively high levels of support to those households with no market income, right? So the very poor among them, but where there are real costs to increasing earnings, right? So these are relative countries that that are less effective in easing the transition back into the labor force. A word of caution here in the interpretation of Greece, right? So a country like Greece, where you can see that the error bounds associated with the estimates are relatively large. These are countries where the functional form doesn't fit quite as well, right? That is, the provision of benefits is not quite as efficient as it is in other countries, which of course is something that conforms to stereotypes about the distribution of benefits in Greece, for example. All right, so where's the US? The US alone is in the bottom right quadrant as a country that provides relatively low levels of support to the very poor, to those with no market income, and where there are actual real costs with increasing earnings among the very poor. We might think of the EITC as being a benefit that helps to smooth the transition back into the labor market, but that benefit actually doesn't kick in until slightly higher levels of income. So for those households that have no market earnings, that moving back into the labor force, even at very low levels of earnings, is actually very costly. Although, of course, the U.S. is kind of just on the other side of that median line. All right. So then, the larger motivating question then about whether or not the countries are providing enough support. Are they providing enough to those who have too little? The overall estimates of poverty relief for these countries suggest that in most post-industrial countries, they provide between about, if we think of the 150% poverty line as kind of being a signal of basic needs, most countries provide about half, all the way up to about 3/4 of the levels of support that are needed to bring household earnings up to that level of meeting basic needs. The U.S. in this respect is a little bit of an outlier, providing just less than half of the support that's needed to meet basic needs in terms of the poverty threshold. And of course, this is a measure that takes into account at least all reported transfers provided to low-income households. So this should be seen as a comprehensive measure. One further feature to note is that, of course, 2010 marks, in some ways, a high watermark in terms of levels of support provided to low-income households. Since 2010, we've seen overall benefit levels decline. And so the overall takeaway point then is that the U.S. safety net, at least when viewed from this perspective of whether or not it's providing sufficient support for low-income households to meet its needs, it has some real work to do. Levels of poverty relief measured in a variety of different ways here in terms of baseline support, easing transition into the labor market, and overall levels of poverty relief are typically more generous and more effective in the other countries that I've looked at.